the topic I'm going to talk about today is deconstruction. And I think it was actually, I wanted to say thank you for the invitation for coming here and talk. And it was really hard to find a concept after the Second World War that was really a proper concept. And I thought, actually, deconstruction qualifies. And it's interesting, and it also disturbs and is present in my own research in various ways that I'll return to. But I think instead of also digging out digging out ditches between the humanities and the sciences, I think I want to start out by emphasizing also that what I see as a common trait between humanities and natural science is actually their interest in research. So finding out what research is something that combines the two. And research, the very concept of research, will also take us a little bit in the direction of how I think deconstruction should be interpreted. So research is something about you go and search for something again, something has puzzled you, something you're interested in, you're in doubt of something just doesn't emerge just as the naive realist, it just appears as a blunt fact. There are very few of these things, and maybe even fewer today, so there's an intimate in the very beginning of what we are doing, no matter if we're doing real research as being a scientist or being a humanist that is doing research. So it opens up with a kind of a questioning, a doubt, and for all of us who have been writing articles, most of you have, and I thought also there would be more politicians in here maybe also that I've talked, but I address, I think, peers here I see in many ways, have been writing articles and books. We have found out, we do iterations, loops of whatever we're doing many, many times, and we come out with a very processed result as a book or monography that maybe have been iterating 100 times. And some of the things that deconstruction tries to do is actually to a little bit, being an archaeologist, dig into the text and find some of the original question tensions that were a little bit maybe on the face of it lost along the way, as that it has been polished 100 times over. And coming up with new interpretations, and I also think maybe that's why also it's hard to find these concepts. While doing research, you often interpret knowns, that giving them new meanings, and new meanings to known concepts as a little bit more maybe the way that a lot of humanist disciplines, they work. So it's not like coining all the time new, they also do that, as deconstruction is the case, coining new terms, but it's very much also a business of reinterpreting, giving new content to, giving new presentations of so-called known concepts. Humanist concepts here about after World War II, I think deconstruction owes primarily thanks to Jacques Derrida. He's associated with this concept. But it was actually one of the concepts that came out of his interpretive work with Martin Heidegger on his destruction of the history of ontology. And also, at least in my interpretation of this, also his work with Nietzsche on the Genealogie der Moral. So that work is pretty much about the dichotomy between good and evil, and how you can, within these very two concepts, in all these dichotomies, there's always one that has the upper hand in the terms of good and evil. It's easy to see, of course, it's the good, but can we also come up with an interpretation saying that actually it's special interests that have gone into this and coming out with defining good in this way and evil in this way? Could there be some good in the evil and some evil in the good? So Jacques Derrida is really much inspired by this tradition. And qualifying it further as a humanist concept, you could say that it's also, as some of the linguists have been talking about before, it's very much in the very beginning text-based, as I also said, rediscovering books, reinterpreting books. And the reason why texts are interesting to humanists is, and it has not been really much mentioned today, that in Greek philosophy, the humans were defined as zoon, logon, ekon. So that is the animal that has language. So if we really want to know what kind of special animal that humans are, then we should investigate language in written and oral form. So the really, you could say, the locus of humanities has been text for a while, and that can, of course, also be unmade and deconstructed in various ways. But that's how it starts out, and that's also how I want to qualify it in the very beginning as a concept that I have been working with. Deconstruction has 2 parts, as you may hear. I have to see where Lone is, so when I know I have 5 minutes left, but she left, so I can just keep on talking. So it has, at least you could say deconstruction has 2 parts. It has a destructive part, but also a constructive part, and maybe people forget that once in a while. And it relates to, say, 3 kinds of criticism. You can even have some external criticism. You come and say, this is wrong because I've seen something else. Or you could say, this is wrong because it's an invalid argument. Or you could come and say, that's a more imminent critique, and you could say, this is an invalid argument. But within your very argument, you could see actually the seed of a different conclusion. And that kind of argument, you could say, that kind of criticism is the very strongest kind of criticism, and that is what is associated with deconstruction. So finding these small premises that lead to other conclusions has to do, you could say, with the deconstructive approach, and of course has to do with, you could say, the devil is in the detail. Something appears in the margins, some very concept is used, but in a slightly in an interesting or in a new way, or 2 concepts from different ways of reasoning are brought together in the same text and creating some kind of tension. So the deconstructive move is actually emphasizing tensions. That's the destructive part. Disclose or unwarranted hierarchies, as the one between good and evil. Display contradictions. Point out the uncertain, underdetermined origins, that the origins are always more powerful and almost more creative, that are always ready for one more interpretation, and devaluate the master narratives, which in the philosophical tradition and many others have often been told by old white males. And then the constructive part has to do with re-evaluating that there's actually a positive result coming out. It's not just standing there and destruct something, it's actually coming out with a new interpretation. Or disclose the untold minority stories and liberate meaning to the destable context. And one of the ways, I want to say, an analogy way of reasoning, deconstruction, we do not talk so much about it anymore, but it is really a powerful concept after World War II. But it has the same way of reasoning have gone into, even though they take a little bit distance from it, I would say going into science studies and their notion of facts. So they are pretty much in science study deconstructed scientific facts, and doesn't mean that there's no facts anymore, but it means, for example, here that what we think of as human is something really contested, and we can see that through these historical examples here with the phenology journal that came out, and the thought that actually the human behavior and human mind could be is directly reflected in the traits in the human face, and that was really thought of as a fact, as a serious science, which was later unrolled, and we found out that a lot of people have been doing this research for a bunch of different political reasons, but also just people who had followed along. And of course, that has been referenced to the Third Reich during these talks, and then their anthropology is also something that is very much contested. So we should actually, in science studies, we should look at the facts produced, but also look at how they are produced. It doesn't mean that there are no facts at all. And the post-factual society is actually a liberation and also something dangerous. But there's just no facts, like there's no naive realism, no facts falling down from the heavens. All of these are constructed and in various ways. Some are really constructed in interesting ways in the laboratory, but what does that mean if something is constructed in the laboratory? Can we take it outside the laboratory? Does it have the same impact? So this deconstructive way of looking at facts is also that should also prepare us to be reflexive about, for example, such things as alternative facts or fake news. News are produced for various reasons, and these news outlets produce so-called also facts all the time. But it's always interesting to see their genealogy. How are they created, and to decide and find out, to come up with a judgment call of finding out which ones are the good facts to continue building on, and which ones are the bad ones. And in these times also of the post-human, which I wanted to also emphasize here, it's interesting also to take up, this is not so nice to our fellow, the fellow animals. We have these mosquitoes down here. They are really the stupidest animals on Earth. They only have this and this few computations. The computer is much smarter than a fly. It has been that for maybe since the 1920s. We have created it. But what does it actually mean to be as smart as a fly? We have no flying idea. I mean, this is just coming into the brain of the and pointing out how many calculations a fly makes per minute. Does that make sense at all? But we accept these narratives all the time and again. So what is this human life at all, and what is it to be human in the future, in our cyborg future? That is a question that poses themselves, and where actually the insights from deconstruction may help us. And to have a last example a little bit of this is also an analogical way of thinking, and also something that owes thanks to deconstruction is modern gender studies and queer studies, and that is a deconstruction of biological sex, saying what is the explanatory power of biological sex. It's much more interesting to look at such a thing as gender. We cannot just divide the population into two interesting natural kinds. These you could say, these we call usually gender, and all these are mental disorders, so we discard this. But there are so many different kinds. So identity is something that's broken down, is deconstructed, and we can choose to see that in the very beginning as a joy and liberation, or we could see this as something we now do not have anything anymore to hold on to. So what I wanted to say a little bit in these times, also with the concept of deconstruction, that the deconstruction of identities is something we should also embrace very much. And it does not have to do with, we see that it's of course interesting, we have been challenged by technologies coming from the outside, modifying what it is to be human. But as we saw in the slide before, what it is to be human has always and should always be something contested. It is not because we just have a sensor now in the brain or our legs are extended that the human nature becomes a contested field. All along, when we make claims about what the human is, what the world are, what things are, what are facts, it is something that we should take up and look at. How do we come to, how is our research initiated? How is it carried out? What are the methodology? And to break that down and investigate it and come up with alternatives that might be liberating, that is the purpose of deconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Søren. Any questions?
I could maybe just add one thing, because I think Rigitte, maybe I uploaded 2 versions of this, I think, and this was the first version of it. There was one slide missing, and that's also where I want to give a little bit, maybe another spin, the deconstruction, and say how it also found its way, you could say, in an analogical way of thinking is in innovation studies, and saying that actually what we have come to think of as creative destruction is something similar to it, and we see that this way of thinking about hacking something, just students working with something, but creating something new out of it, seeing maybe also the very first, now I do a little bit snowboarding also, the first snowboarders, they took actually a surfboard and broke off the fins, so they destructed it, but it became something else, it became a snowboard. Those kind of moves happen all the time, and you could say they are deconstructive moves, and they happen also in innovation studies, and that's a little bit more popular take on this, but I also expected people from outside academia to come, and but I think also it's useful maybe to have as an example to think of the constructive part of deconstruction.
Well, thank you again. There is a question, yes.
Thank you for the talk, which I liked. Could you give us an example of the use of the term deconstruction in a properly understood way outside of, I don't know, Derridian thinking?
Outside of what kind of thing?
Of Derrida, or
yeah, I mean, I think what I wanted to point out too is a little bit this, that the breaking down of seeing gender as something different and more than just bipolar. So actually coming up with all these new categories is a deconstruction. You destruct the biological sex and come up with, and also what I mentioned about the...
People don't talk about it that way.
No, it's true. That's a good point, and I think that deconstruction, I mean, we do not speak so much about it, and I think also there are interesting ways of finding out why we do not use the concept so much in all these concepts. It is used also in architecture, maybe more proper. It is used in different concepts, but there is maybe a need in humanities and also to stay on top of the game and make journalists and other people write about you to come up with new concepts all the time. And we do not use the concepts anymore, but the very way of thinking is inherent in many fields and has become normal academic praxis, in my interpretation.
Dr. O'Neill?
In everyday life, the metaphor of destruction is very much discussed, and in contemporary philosophy, the metaphor of construction is quite fundamental both in epistemology and in political philosophy. How can you discuss deconstruction without mentioning either of them?
Because I have 10-15 minutes. But there are different takes, and also to which kind of audience you address them. But I will then say, and I should have done it in, this was not a comprehensive talk on deconstruction. I do not say everything that is to be said about that concept, and I'm guilty of that also.
Nice excuse. Is there a last question, perhaps?
So you did not go either into, so there's another comment on the, you mentioned briefly the science wars, right?
Yeah.
The relation between deconstruction at that time. And what I was puzzled about was the following. So nowadays, you but also other people like Latour recently is really saying deconstruction is important to figure out when we're talking about fake news, which I fully agree with. But how do you relate them to the same persons, and indeed also Bruno Latour and others, who in the 1970s and 80s tried also to deconstruct facts that we nowadays think, but these were actually scientific facts, more or less, that were heavily criticized at that time. But on the other, maybe I'm also biased here. So just
I think they can maybe be accessed in different ways, but I think actually what they finally wanted to get at is just like all the amount of that there are actually good creations, good fabrications, and bad fabrication. It doesn't mean that that you can just say when you reveal something as fabricated that it's just downright wrong, but it is under certain circumstances. And I also think that this historical view also found out, somebody else said no facts are forever. Somebody else said that. And if we come 100 years later, then see how much of what we have produced today as facts are still standing. And that has to do with, there has been some local contextual things to the way we have produced facts or in our epistemology that come out, and it's good enough, and we cannot really, we should not wish to go back to a point of time, and that's what I actually think is positive about the post-factual society, where we just think that the facts are eternal and unalterable.
Well, although there is a notion of truth finding.
For example, also...
6 million Jews were killed during the Second World War.
No,
but
no, that's a good... I mean, then it's not that part is that is... Then the fact is, okay, that would be interesting to say, which counting method are you using? Is it 5 million or 6 million or something? That would be interesting. Or what does it mean to be killed during the war and after the war? And those things coming up with this, it's not that no people were killed during the Second World War. I mean, it's just from the...
The risk is relativism. Sorry.
The risk is but there are risks of relativism. But I think when you go into the constructual part of it, then it's the relativism is relativized also. So.
Well,
get that.
Ending on the meta perspective. Well, thank you, Søren.